My name is Nick Floyd. I have a long history with Magic the Gathering. I created the Dandan variant. Now I'm creating this. Welcome to Magic Storytime. Today's trivia question is, so in the early years of Magic in the mid-1990s, the internet was still in its infancy and the information online was not well organized, especially for niche hobbies like the early collectible card game market. Like sports cards, finding the going prices for cards in your collection took finding the most recent price guide publication and looking it up in its pages. These were magazines whose primary function was as a price guide. I have previously mentioned the magazines of The Duelist and Inquest. The Duelist was published by Wizards of the Coast, and it would not have been appropriate for them to publish a price guide for the secondary market, and it was news and articles about upcoming products and trends within the game. Inquest, on the other hand, had articles about the game as well as a price guide. But there was another magazine prior to Inquest that was primarily a price guide for Magic and other collectible card games, with fewer articles. What was the name of that publication? Hint: its name, a term in legendary or mythical divination, is now a Magic the Gathering keyword ability, though with a slightly different spelling. Stay tuned to the end of the episode for the answer. This is Danecdote number 4, A Blue Mage's Dream. I touched on this topic in a previous video, but here it is in more detail. About 1997, I became known as a blue control player. Took Big Blue to Mountain Regionals in 97, see episodes 1 and 2, and counterpost at Nationals of that year, see episode 10. And many years later, I finally won the Wyoming State Championship with a blue-green control deck. A Magic story for another time. I think I can credit Dandan Deck for teaching me how to play control well. I have a theory in Magic, that a new Magic player will most often gravitate towards fast creature decks first. These are usually red, white, or green decks that are pretty straightforward with simple strategies where you are mostly attacking aggressively and removing obstacles in the way. These are the basic strategies of Magic. That is not to say that these strategies are not good or not worthwhile, just that they are the easiest to start with for the average new player. The next level is usually black, as black decks often have a greater reliance on using life as a resource, more complex strategies like disruption, and more risk management. And finally, the more advanced strategy involves blue control decks that have the deepest strategies where every play is a thought-out decision. This is a basic theory and does not apply to all players and does not account for personal tastes. I would say that blue control is the most advanced strategy in Magic because it takes knowledge of how all the other basic strategies work so that you know what cards to say no to and what cards you can let pass. When I began playing Magic in 1994, I started with the basic strategies and I took a green-red creature burn deck to my first little tournament. I played red burn, white weenie, and black suicide strategies, as well as quirky strategies combining colors, but never blue control. I knew of blue control decks from word of mouth and Magic magazines like The Duelist and Inquest, but I never really experienced playing or playing against one. Finally, probably in 95 or 96, I decided to try to build a blue counter deck and bring it to the play group I had started. What I knew, or thought I knew, about blue counterspell decks was that they just said no to everything and tried to stop the opponent from playing anything, and that is why they had a bad reputation. So I set out to build one of these counter decks. I stuffed it full of the best counterspells I had, and when I played it, I just tried to counter everything my opponent played. Well, if you know where I'm going with this, it didn't work. That's not how blue counter decks work, and after trying it a few times and finding that eventually my opponent would cast something I couldn't counter and overwhelm me, I took that first blue monstrosity apart and didn't try again for months. If I'm not mistaken, it was in these intervening months I built the first Dandan deck. This had to be sometime in 96. It was a control deck, but the fact that you and your opponent played out of the same library, and I knew exactly what to expect, I knew how and what to counter. I have heard and seen plenty of Magic players say that Dandan is a great tool for teaching the intricacies of Magic, the stack, and how to play Control. I would have to agree, and I think it was its invention that finally taught me how to actually play Control and gave birth to my largest successes as a tournament Magic player. What to counter and when. Forgetful Fish Dandan is a great way to teach how to play Control Magic. And a player who plays Dandan early in their experience with Magic may just skip to the Control level quickly. I have plans to talk about Dandan and why I have not changed my official list based on cards I have seen other Dandan players use in their decks, and reasons for cutting cards I am playing in mine. But if I wait to do that, it will be a long time before I talk about it, as they would be very late Danecdotes originating only in recent years. So I'm going to talk about these a little at the end of my Danecdotes. One reason I have not changed my deck, other than finally giving up on trying to make Insidious Will work and going back to 8 memory laps, is to keep it the same as the original list I posted in 2016. I added Mystic Sanctuary in 2019 when Throne of Eldraine was released, since it is a non-basic island and has the magical phrase, top of your library. And I tried Insidious Will, but that's it. I haven't seen a card, new or old, that has jumped out at me as a must-play, or an easy replacement for another card, though there have been some close calls. I'll talk about some of those in future Danecdotes, but this time I want to talk about the cards many players cut. I want to add that many card choices for Dandan are subjective besides the memory lapse and the eponymous fish, and I acknowledge that in my Forgetful Fish Google Doc, there are many cards that work well. That said, I still love my list, though I know it is not perfect, and there are some card choices that are not ideal for players who have less experience with Dandan or my specific list. Anyway, I had a recent game where a sequence of plays involved 3 of what I think are the most commonly cut cards from my list. I was playing with Miguel. We played Dandan before, but may not have known the exact contents of my Forgetful Fish list. It was pretty late in the game, and we both had taken some Dandan hits. There was a rather large graveyard with 3 of the 4 accumulated knowledge already in there. We both had around 5 cards in hand, and I had a Dandan in play. During my end step, Miguel played a Mystical Tutor, probably the most cut card in my original list, for understandable reasons, and I knew immediately he was going to grab the last AK to put on top, which he did. Looking at my hand, I had no other way to draw or steal it off the top. I couldn't let him draw a 2-mana draw 4 if I could help it, but the only card in my hand that could stop it was the other copy of Mystical Tutor, which would let me set up his draw instead with an instant or sorcery of my choice. Playing a little by the seat of my pants and not looking through the deck, I immediately declared what card I would be grabbing to put on top. Vision Charm, I said. Miguel must have been confused, wondering what I was up to, giving him the 1-mana board wipe, another of the most commonly cut cards from my list, when I was the only one with a Dandan in play. I mean, if I had a memory lapse, I would have just waited to counter the AK, right? What the heck was I doing? Like I said, I'm not sure if Miguel was familiar with my list, or he might have guessed it. Miguel just drew and passed turn, probably not wanting to walk into whatever I was up to. Then, on my turn, after I attacked him down to 3 hits, I dropped a second Dandan, adding to his confusion. He must have been biding his time and trying to draw another card that could disrupt whatever I was up to. Maybe the elusive 4th AK or diminishing returns to get rid of my hand. He took a hit from my double Dandans, putting him at a single Dandan hit for life. He took another draw go turn and let me go again. Finally, on my attack phase, he cast the Vision Charm to try to kill my 2 attacking fish. I responded by casting Dance of the Skywise on each of my 2 Dandans, having both copies in hand, another of the most cut cards from my list. He had in fact drawn another Disruption spell and memory lapsed one of the 2 Dance, but as he was only at 1 hit, my surviving Dandan took him out of the game. A short time later, I realized that all 3 of the key cards in this endgame interaction were probably the 3 most cut cards from my Forgetful Fish list: Mystical Tutor, Vision Charm, and Dance of the Skywise. That doesn't mean these cards should be kept in all Dandan decks, just that so many cards can create unique situations and tricky plays in a game of Dandan. and that's what makes it so worth it. Today's trivia question is, so in the early years of Magic in the mid-1990s, the internet was still in its infancy and the information online was not well organized, especially for niche hobbies like the early collectible card game market. Like sports cards, finding the going prices for cards in your collection took finding the most recent price guide publication and looking it up in its pages. These were magazines whose primary function was as a price guide. I have previously mentioned the magazines of The Duelist and Inquest. The Duelist was published by Wizards of the Coast, and it would not have been appropriate for them to publish a price guide for the secondary market, and it was news and articles about upcoming products and trends within the game. Inquest, on the other hand, had articles about the game as well as a price guide. But there was another magazine prior to Inquest that was primarily a price guide for Magic and other collectible card games, with fewer articles. What was the name of that publication? Hint: its name, a term in legendary or mythical divination, is now a Magic the Gathering keyword ability, though with a slightly different spelling. Answer: the other magazine and price guide for Magic and the constantly changing collectible card game of the month in the mid-1990s that predated Inquest was called Scry, with an E. Scry was published from 1994 until 2009. I only bought a couple of issues of Scry, as it was completely supplanted for me by Inquest magazine when it was published in 1995, as Inquest just had more to offer me with its higher emphasis on articles and humor as well as a price guide. According to the internet, Scry ceased publication in 2009, 2 years after Inquest ceased in 2007. Scry was the longest running magazine for the collectible card game hobby. So, what do I know? Thank you for joining me for this episode. Please like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment. In fact, please leave a comment telling me what your favorite card you have seen in a Dandan list that I am not playing in mine